The following is episode 4 of the Octagon of Reason, a conversation with Professor Rebecca Tuvel. We talked about her Jewish upbringing and how that may have influenced the way she understands the divine, and also how, to a certain extent, how that influenced her choice in becoming a philosopher. We also spent a significant amount of time going back and forth on the concepts of transracialism and transgenderism in light of her paper in Defense of Transracialism. I would like to remind you all of the motto of the Octagon of Reason, which is built upon the famous Voltaire quotes, which says, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight till death to protect your right of saying it." So I hope you guys have that quote ringing at the back of your mind as you go through this episode. So make sure you subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and tell us what you thought of the episode in the comments down below. Also, make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because that's where we post every single one of our episodes. Just search Octagon of Reason and you should be able to find us there. So now, without further ado, my name is Kelton Giovanni Massinga, and this is the Octagon of Reason. In 2015, the former American Olympic gold medalist Bruce Jenner successfully transitioned from male to female, an event that was deemed monumental to the popularity of the transgender movement. Bruce Jenner, now Caitlyn Jenner, was hailed as Woman of the Year by the Vanity Fair magazine and was also the recipient of the Courage Award at that year's ESPY ceremony. Around the same time, however, Rachel Dolezal, then president of the NAACP chapter in Spokane, Washington, made headline news for claiming to be a Black woman whilst being born Caucasian. It was in light of this that a Toronto native philosopher, filled with compassion for Dolezal, came out 2 years later in her support, stating that the arguments supporting transgenderism are the same that support transracialism. Unlike Jenner, however, and to a certain extent, one could even argue that as far as Dolezal is concerned, this philosopher was lambasted online by her fellow philosophers, other academics, and people who deemed her argument to be absolutely appalling. Before this person was deemed as this horrible trans-misogynistic individual by some, or intellectually courageous by others, she was already an associate professor of philosophy at Rhodes College, and since 2020, she has been the chair of the philosophy department at that institution. She earned her PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University, and her research interests are on ethics, feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, applied ethics, and political philosophy. This person's entire worldview can be perfectly summed up by this Spinoza quote: "I've taken great care not to deride, bewail, or execrate human actions, but to understand them." So it is my hope that whether you agree or disagree, or you are indifferent to this person's views, that this conversation may help you to understand her views before you form your own conclusions. So without further ado, Professor Rebecca Tuvel, welcome to the Octagon of Reason.
Thank you. That was such a lovely introduction, Kelton. I really appreciate it. Sorry.
So go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say one tiny correction. I think you mentioned I was associate professor when the controversy erupted, but I was actually assistant professor.
Oh, you were assistant professor. Okay.
So yeah, I was pre-tenure at that time.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I always think you were above, you've always been a step above everybody else. But first of all, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. I don't know if you know this, but I think I've been trying to get you on the show for like 6 months now. So props to me for finally making it happen, and props to you for accepting the invitation as well. So before we delve into the nitty-gritty of this entire conversation, I want to reverse engineer your life. I want to talk about your upbringing in Canada. I did not know you were Canadian. So I was thinking, does she say like sorry, and like, does she go out with her friends? I was trying to like find like, the Canadian accent coming in, but I couldn't find it. But anyways, so essentially, how was it growing up in Canada? How was your upbringing back in Canada? And was there any childhood story that influenced your career choice as a philosopher?
Mm. Yeah, so I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, in a Jewish family, and that was a pretty major part of my upbringing. We had Friday night Shabbat dinners at my mom's parents every week, and I became very close with my grandparents and extended family through that. Both my grandfathers were also Holocaust survivors, so that was a pretty significant part of my upbringing. You know, my dad's dad didn't speak about it very much, but my mom's father did speak about it, and he emphasized the importance of, you know, Jewish identity and, you know, keeping alive like the Jewish tradition in light of that after, you know, seeing his family and friends decimated in front of his eyes. So, you know, I think that part of my upbringing probably did have an influence on the kinds of subjects that I became interested in later, like,
Mhm.
you know, race and racism and identity as well. Jewish identity is interesting in that, you know, we do allow for a conversion process, right? So you can see the natural connections to an interest in transracial identity or cross-racial kinds of identities. Other things about my upbringing, yeah, I had a great childhood, and after growing up in Toronto, I went to McGill University in Montreal, and it was there that I really became interested in philosophy. So I didn't have any exposure to philosophy in high school, but I took an intro to philosophy course in undergrad, and I just remember thinking that that was the only course after which I exited the classroom having completely different outlook on the world and on different moral questions. And I just thought that was totally invaluable.
Mhm.
So I also got really interested in animal ethics in undergrad as well. And I was exposed to different arguments for and against eating meat. And I had to like participate in a debate on meat eating. And I became pretty invested in that topic and just thought the tools of philosophy were so incredibly valuable for helping us assess difficult moral questions like whether it's okay to eat meat. And also, if it's done right, it can teach you how to engage properly and responsibly in those kinds of debates, right? By, for instance, giving the most charitable interpretation to, you know, the person who disagrees with you, and, you know, how to engage in civil disagreement and
Mhm.
about hot topics. So yeah, all of those things.
I read somewhere that I'm not sure if it was by the time you got to college that you started questioning the existence of God, having been
Mm.
brought up in a Jewish household. I just wanted to clarify, were you brought up religiously Jewish or just culturally Jewish?
Yeah, I was brought up culturally Jewish. I mean, I went to Hebrew school and I had a bat mitzvah, and obviously at Hebrew school, I think I was introduced there, obviously, to more religious element of Judaism. But in my own home life, the religious aspect wasn't emphasized as much. And my own grandfather, my mother's dad, who's the one who I was closest to, he was very culturally Jewish, but not religiously so. And I think his experience in the Holocaust played a role in that too. I think the problem of evil is a tough one for Holocaust survivors. Like, how could God allow such a thing to happen? And I understand that there are views of God that can allow for tragedies and horrific genocides,
Mhm.
but I also understand that it's difficult to really wrap your head around the idea of a benevolent God allowing something like that to happen. So, yeah, for me, the belief in God wasn't such a major part of my upbringing for those reasons.
So,
Yeah.
so because you were not brought up religiously Jewish, right? So when do you start questioning the existence of God? So it's like, what is it? So what is maybe one event? It could be the fact that you were very close to your grandfather and he used to share Holocaust survivor stories. That could be it. Or it was probably a class you took in college. So like, what was that thing or that conversation, that person that made you start questioning about the possibility of the existence of a divine deity?
Mhm. Yeah, I do think that my experience with my grandfathers probably played a role in that. I also think that I, I was always questioning things from a young age, like why do we do this? I mean, kids do that all of the time, but I think I was especially obnoxious about it.
Mhm.
So, why do we need separate plates for milk and meat? And why is this a rule that we follow for? And if I didn't get satisfying answers to those questions, I think I took more of an um, agnostic kind of stance on
Okay.
them. So I think just the evidence for God's existence to me was not sufficiently compelling to really warrant like a full scale belief.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Is that something that still keeps you up at night, or are you settled with the fact that, well, I don't think God exists, so I'm not going to dwell with that anymore. I'm just going to focus on something else. Where do you stand right now? Do you still question
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
I don't believe that there's a God, but it's something that I it probably should keep me up at night more than it does.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
if it's a
Mhm.
God, the consequences
Mhm.
um, are significant. But no, it's not something that I dwell on, honestly.
Okay. Uh, do you remember anything you read maybe that sort of allowed you to have a more comfortable stance around the belief in God? Was there anything that you read you're like, okay, this guy or this girl seems to get it, so this is where I stand?
I was definitely very influenced by Spinoza
Okay.
in undergrad, and he's got this great preface to the theological political treatise in which he kind of goes on this uh, diatribe against religion and belief in God. And I just thought it was a really powerful and just engaging, well written, kind of funny a few pages that made some really compelling points about human nature and our desire to imagine a fiction that helps us through, but that is ultimately a fiction. So
Okay.
I think I was influenced by Spinoza's atheistic points, although of course he's complicated because I mean some people read him as a pantheist, somebody who thinks that God inheres in everything. But then of course it matters what kind of God we're talking about, because for Spinoza, God is synonymous with nature, with existence, with substance. Those are all the same terms for him. It's kind of just God is everything, but God is not the Judeo-Christian conception of God who can, hear prayers or that sort of thing.
Okay.
So it's, I think calling him an atheist is appropriate in light of that. And of course, he was treated as such and
Mhm.
received death threats and excommunicated from his Jewish community for all the things that he uttered.
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
also was influenced by him just because he was such a brave philosophical
Yeah.
model,
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. So the first guest I had on the show was Professor Wirtles, and then I had
Uh,
Professor Sampson, and you are my third guest, right? And
You love the philosophy department.
I just love the philosophy department, and all three of you have different
Mm,
understanding and different approaches to this idea of God, right?
yeah.
I'm pretty sure you know them more than I do, but Professor Wills, he doesn't necessarily say that there is no God, but he says that he stands on the side of reason. But then you
Mhm,
have Professor Sampson, who is a full blown Baptist, right? And
mhm,
then there's you, right? You pretty much you are an atheist, right?
mhm,
So
mhm.
I think uh, you know between those two views, I would like to hear what's your perspective on Professor Will's point that he stands on the side of reason, that it's not saying that there is no God, but he prefers to stand on the side of reason. Because I want to believe that it was reason that led you to believe in what you believe about God, right? So how do you pretty much put these 2 points in conversation with each other?
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine Professor Sampson would say that it is also his reason that leads him to his belief.
Exactly.
And I mean, I'm sure he would say that. Um, so I haven't spoken to Professor Worrells about his views on God. Actually,
Okay,
I should
okay.
listen to the episode that you did with him, obviously.
Mhm.
But I guess when I think of how it is that I form beliefs, or how it is that we in general ought to form beliefs, it's on the basis of strong evidence. And obviously that evidence can come in many forms,
Mhm.
but the evidence that's often cited, like in defense of God's existence, for me is just not evidence that I find compelling, right? So there are a lot of claims that I have a hard time getting behind, as far as like, the nature of biblical authority, for instance, right? Like
Okay.
this,
Can you say more about it?
like the source of biblical authority, for instance, like who, there obviously there's a fundamental disagreement between, secular minded folks and religious minded folks when it comes
Mhm.
to like who actually um uh, who actually wrote the Bible, right? Like who actually um uh, passed down the lessons, right, within the Bible. Was it from some divine authority, right, whether transmitted like through humans, or was it just humans kind of coming up with these codes themselves? I think that makes a really big difference in terms of how much authority you grant to biblical texts,
Okay.
right? So for me, I just have a hard time getting on board with the idea, or the evidence, I guess, that suggests that it was divinely like um, ordained, right? Rather than
Okay.
just,
Have you heard of Joshua Rasmussen?
no, I
No?
mean, yeah, is this a philosopher of
He's a
religion?
philosopher. I'm trying to remember where he teaches, but he wrote this book entitled "How Reason." No, I think that is "Can Reason Lead to God?" Right? And
Mhm,
I think and he tries to make a very philosophical argument for the existence of God. Right?
mhm.
I found it compelling. So now you may argue that, well, you find it compelling because you are a Christian, so there's that playing in your mind already. But I find it to be compelling. So whenever you have the chance, I would love to, if you can read it, I would love to hear your thoughts on it for sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is not an area of study for me. So I
Mhm.
admit that there's tons that I don't know in the, the literature and the, so certainly, thank you for the recommendation, and yeah, I'll take a look.
Yeah, for sure. I would love to keep on talking about this, but because we know what the people came here for. So let's talk about transracialism, right? Let's talk
Okay.
about In Defense of Transracialism. So I
Mhm.
have the paper here with me. I have read
Mm.
it 3 times now. The first
Oh.
time was back in freshman year when I first heard
Oh.
about the concept of transracialism. Well, I
Mm.
don't think I should say that I actually read it. I skimmed through it, right? Because I
Uh-huh.
just wanted to understand what it is. But I watched a lot of podcasts and videos of people explaining the concept and also talking about the paper. The second
Mm.
time was during my 13-hour flights from the US to Ethiopia. So that was pretty fun. And the third time was last night. As I was preparing myself for this conversation. And I must say something. My conclusion has remained the same.
Mhm.
I disagree with both transgenderism and transracialism, but I do agree with the assertion you make in the
Mhm.
argument that if you take one to be true, then you
Mhm.
should, by reason, take the other to be true. It's the whole idea that what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, right?
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
works for one must work for other, taking them in the same conditions. So I am fully on board with the argument that you make on here in the paper. But before we
Yeah.
start talking about the relationship between transgenderism and transracialism, I want us to isolate these 2 concepts and look at them separately, if we may. right?
Yeah.
So let's start off with transgenderism. You say, actually, before I go on to ask the question, would you mind defining the terms transgenderism, transracialism, and essentially the thesis, your thesis here on the paper, just before we keep things off?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I understand, transgender people to be those who have gender identities that come apart from their birth sex, from their natal sex. And this might differ from how I originally defined it in the paper, by the way, because it's been a minute since then, but I think it's effectively the same, probably. Transracial people are, analogous, not identical, of course, to transgender people in that they have racial identities that come apart from their presumed race, right? So there are obviously relevant differences there, and there are a lot of different ways of being transgender, and there are different ways of being transracial. But those are kind of the broad definitions that I operate with. I also distinguish between, so in the book that I'm writing, and not in the paper that you read, I distinguish between transracial identity and transracialism. So transracial identity I refer to as somebody holds a transracial identity if, like, they think of themselves as a member of a race, like they think of themselves as Black, they think of themselves as Asian or white, in a manner that differs from their presumed race, right?
Mm-hmm.
But transracialism is the view that it's possible to change race.
Okay.
So, because I think that, you say that you I think you disagree, or I don't remember how you phrased it. That
No, I said that I
or
disagree with both
with both,
transgenderism
right?
and transracialism.
Right. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to unpack what you mean by disagree there, because you can imagine people disagreeing with different things, right? So somebody might disagree with transracialism, the idea that it's possible to change race. They might not disagree with transracial identity if, for instance, all that means is that there are people who hold transracial identities, I mean, so you can imagine different degrees of commitment
Okay.
on this topic, right? So I think during the controversy, there were people who both said, most often there's no such thing as transracialism, meaning it's not possible to change race. There were other people who said there aren't any transracial people. There aren't people who hold these identities.
Okay. Okay. I see what you're saying.
So for Rachel Dolezal, for instance, or who now identifies as like Nkechi Diallo,
Amari something. Yeah, I think that's her
yeah,
name. Mm-hmm.
yeah. The response to her was that she didn't hold a genuine transracial identity, and that there aren't really people like this, right?
Okay.
So part of my task is to show that that's mistaken, but then the other part of the task is obviously to defend the more controversial view about transracialism itself, or the idea that it's possible to change race.
Okay. So maybe let me expound on what I mean by disagreeing with transracialism and transgenderism. But maybe before that, you also make a distinction between, so under transgenderism, there are those who are transsexuals. And I'm assuming those are the ones that have went surgery to go from one sex to another, right?
Yeah.
But then they are transgender people who say they look male, but they identify themselves as female. So by looking at them without talking to them, you would say, "Oh, male." But if you talk to them, they'll be, "No, I am female," right? But they could have a full full-on beard. They could look just like me, but still identify as female, right?
Yeah.
So I disagree with the idea that, and I disagree with the idea that it is possible for both to change your race and your gender, right?
Yeah.
But I also struggle with the idea that there are people that feel like they do not belong in the gender they were born with. When I mean, what I mean by that is that I'm not saying that when they say it, they're lying. No, I'm saying that I don't think we should take it as facts. We should try to understand what that means first, right? Before we go about accepting it. That's my point. That's what I'm trying to say, because it's more like, okay, why should we agree that that's the case before we can scientifically prove that there are people that the people who feel that way are actually in their right to feel that way? Does it make sense? Like there's no maybe there's no difference in their psychological composition that makes them feel that way, and we should just simply accept it. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's where I find myself. I still struggle with the concept, right?
That makes sense. I understand what you're saying.
Mhm.
So I mean, there's a stronger and a more modest version of what you just said, right? And I guess I'm curious to know if you hold the more modest version or the stronger version. So the modest version of what you said is something like, look, there are some people who identify as trans for whom that might not be the full psychological story. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe that's a way that they're understanding themselves at this moment in time, but then, they go through therapy and start to understand that there are different elements of their identity that are influencing their self-understanding, and maybe they realize that they're gay, or I mean, you might acknowledge that in some cases, and we know this. I mean, there are cases of people, especially younger people, who will self-identify as trans, but then realize later that that's not in fact how they identify, right? But the stronger claim of version of what you said would be that in all cases of transgender identity, there's always something else going on, right? That there's always an alternative explanation for somebody's gender identity that suggests that trans identities are always kind of mistakenly held in some way. Now, that stronger version of the argument, I think, is much more difficult to defend, because there are loads of transgender people whose testimony suggests that not only are these sincerely held, persistent, insistent identities, but who experience great relief upon transition and who go on to live like full lives in their assumed genders. And clearly that was the struggle that they needed help with, particularly their transgender identity. So I guess I'm wondering, are you in favor of the more modest claim or the stronger claim? Because, the implications are different.
I think I'm leaning more towards the latter. I'm leaning more towards the stronger claim, right? And my reasoning for it is that I'm still trying to understand, because when somebody says, somebody that was born male, and they say that they're actually female, now for me it begs the question, how do you know that? How do you know that you're not male, and how do you know that you're female? And if you say that you're female, then what does it mean to be female, right? So maybe I'm still there. I'm still in the early stages of the argument. I'm still trying to understand, how could someone say that they're not they're not the person they were born as, and instead they're something or someone else, right?
Yeah, well, so oftentimes the claims are not so much like I am female, but rather for a very long time and in a very insistent manner, I have always felt like I ought to have been born female, because I so identify so strongly, as a girl or as a woman, that something is not right. And there are many folks who think that we can locate a neuroscientific explanation for some cases of transgender identity, right? So the jury's still out on that, but there are folks who argue that in some cases there's clearly like a neurological basis for what's going on here. So, I mean, obviously we don't know everything that there is to know, but I think if you read the testimony of many transgender identified people, you'll see that that this is clearly a real phenomenon, and again, one that once people seek, gender confirmation surgery, or they undergo efforts to align their self-presentation with their gender identity, which again, not everybody feels the need to do, but some do, and they often report experiencing like major relief, and which suggests that the problem they identified which is that related to their transgender identity, was in fact actually the problem. Because if they didn't experience that relief later on, then you might think, well, something else is going on. But it's gotten it very messy because the discourse about transgender identity has like exploded in recent years in a way that is totally different from even just 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so we have seen like way more cases of self-identified trans people, especially among younger people. And that has led some folks to wonder, what are all the different causal factors that are leading to transgender identity? Like, can all of them be explained in terms of some sort of, neurological explanation? Certainly not, right? They're very different ways of being trans. Then others who wonder how much of this has to do with just like the social context in which we're in now. And, there are some folks who've argued that there are influences in certain social circles and friend groups that might be leading some kids to think that they're trans when they're not. And so obviously what we want to just be really cautious and careful, because we want to help ensure young people in particular, when they start to understand themselves as holding a certain identity, and especially when they want to make changes to their bodies based on that identity, you want to make sure that it's truly, a truly held, sincerely held identity.
So in the paper, you try to draw an analogy between religious conversion and transgenderism, the process of changing from one gender to another, and you give the example of someone who strongly connects or strongly associates him or herself with the Jewish religion and attempts to convert him or herself, right? And then you have the rabbi there that pretty much it functions as the gatekeeper, right? So if this person seems not to be taking the conversion process seriously, then the rabbi can block that conversion, right? So I was thinking to myself, in the context of gender and race, transition of gender and race, who acts as the rabbi in that case, right? Who acts as a rabbi in that case? And the first thought that came to mind was, well, biology acts like the rabbi in that case, right? So that was the first thing that came to mind. And obviously, that's your paper tries to provide more, maybe more rabbi-like components for that context, right? And you offer two components, right? The first is the self-identification, and the second thing is how people within that particular community feel about you attaining membership into that community, right? In the sense of like, you want one self-identifies as male, right? So the process of conversion starts from self-identification, and it finishes with the people in the male community accepting that person as male. In light of that, right? How can we, like, how many people within that community have to be willing to grant the membership of the person that self-identifies as a part of that community?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and is relevant to one of the reasons why I've actually revised my view as originally articulated in that paper 6 years ago. So I don't actually hold the view anymore that, in order to transition successfully, like the members of relevant society and the relevant social group have to like grant you membership, because there are several insurmountable problems that we face if we set that aside as like a requisite criterion. So obviously one of the reasons you just mentioned, which is how do we decide how many people and which people get to decide, that you ought to be granted membership? And also, more importantly, why should we just defer to the masses when in fact, people could be very mistaken or bigoted or have all sorts of different motivations for accepting individuals, into a relevant group. So I think I relied far too much on this idea of like communal acceptance in that paper. I think instead we need to just evaluate the best reasons, right, for and against transition, regardless of how people actually feel about it in a relevant society, right? So, yeah, so that element of my view has changed.
Okay. So, okay, I understand what you're saying. And
Yeah.
although you're now saying that there, and we mentioned one being the fact that we're not sure how many people have to be willing to accept one's entry into that particular community, right? That's one problem. As much as we can't necessarily answer all those questions, I still think that the willingness of the members of that society to accept this newcomer is still an important point in this entire conversation, because I'm thinking about in the case of women, right? There's this term for feminists who reject transgenders or against transgenderism to a certain extent. I think it's TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminists, right? The J.K. Rowlings of the world are referred to as trans exclusionary radical feminists. And there's Abigail Schreier, the author of I think is Irreversible Damage. So and so many others, right? And their argument is that for so long they've been fighting for the rights of women, and it seems to them that all of a sudden man can freely walk into womanhood and enjoy the same rights as other women, and one of them, and I think a huge part of that population of that group rather was very much against Caitlyn Jenner winning Woman of the Year, for instance, right? In your first year as a woman, here you are becoming Woman of the Year. So those are like the things that, as much as, yes, you have changed your view, I still think it's important because we're dealing with people that were born this way. They live their lives like this, right? But now they must accept that there are people that feel the same way as they do, right? And they just have to accept it. So I think that there needs to be something more there. I think, and also think that that's part of the reason why I'm still on the very early stages of this argument, because I'm struggling to go over that hurdle.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So certainly, yeah, there are many gender critical feminists, as they prefer to be called. They've argued that the term TERF is effectively a slur.
Derogatory, right? Yeah.
Right. I think that's true. And I think it's stalled like productive conversation across disagreement in this domain. But, for all the gender critical feminists, of course, there are tons of trans affirming feminists and women who are very much, welcoming of trans women and who want to create, more inclusive spaces that accommodate, both cis women and trans women. And so, pointing to the fact that there are women who, don't accept trans women, I think, only shows that the problems with relying on widespread acceptance when determining something like whether or not transition should be allowed, right? Because there are tons of people. I mean, we're talking about, millions billions of people in this case, actually.
Mhm.
And it gets far too messy, first off, to try to determine, what the widespread attitude is, because in this case, obviously, there's tons of tension and there's no consensus.
Mhm.
But more importantly, going back to what I said earlier, I think if you just defer to the people, you risk not paying attention to what's really important, which are the reasons, right? So, I mean, the reason I've changed my view is that I think it could be the case that, like, everybody is actually wrong about these issues.
Mhm.
Um, and that a society ought to, like, normatively practice, more acceptance than it does. And
Mhm.
that could still imply that, trans individuals should be allowed more, freedoms than previously allowed, despite what people think, right? But, we can readily acknowledge that, and my view is that we can readily acknowledge that there are just a lot of different ways of being members of a category. So, you mentioned my example of Jewish conversion. I'm a Jew, and a big part of my Jewish identity obviously has to do with, like, being the granddaughter of survivors, right? But for me, um, that doesn't mean that somebody else whose Jewish identity is entirely disconnected from such a history, or maybe even somebody who's converted to Judaism, is, like, any less authentic or any less um, important to acknowledge, right? So I think that there are different ways of being a woman, right? So for some women, for a lot of women, being female bodied and, being able to bear children, right? Or all of that is really important to how they understand themselves as women. But that's not true for all women, right? That's not true for trans women. I mean, it's going to just it's going to differ, sorry, depending on the kind of member of the category that
Mhm.
you are. Um, so the larger question is, what does moral treatment of individuals with these strong trans self-identities involve? That's the deeper question here, right? What
Mhm.
is it? What does it mean for a society to do right by people um, who who proclaim these self-identities and who are clearly, um, extremely distressed and suffering from intense dysphoria if they're unable to get the treatment that they need, right? What does it mean for us to practice acceptance in a responsible manner, right? So, and again, I think in the case of gender, it does get very complicated in some cases, wherein, like, how loose should the requirements be?
Mhm.
Should self-identification alone be sufficient for getting into any woman's space, right? There are concerns, for instance, that, like, male rapists will just self-identify into women's prisons.
Mhm.
Yeah, if the requirement is super minimal, that actually says nothing about trans women, but it says something about the system being able to be abused readily by, people who could um, identify as trans for nefarious purposes, right? So, like, those questions are super important questions.
Mhm.
I don't think you should be lambasted as, like, transphobic for asking them or thinking that they're important.
So I think, and I want to believe that any reasonable individual would think the same, that everybody should be treated with dignity in society, regardless of how they feel about themselves, how they feel about their bodies. Everybody should be treated with dignity. That's what it means to uphold human rights. Nonetheless, uh, regarding the issue of transgenderism, right? I still think that as a society, as we're having this conversation, as a society, as the global society is having this conversation, we should first try to understand, uh, come up with an accurate diagnosis before we move on to the solution. right? Because I still feel as if, yes, this is how they feel, but the reason as to why they feel this way are not clear yet. And just because we haven't found a way to clarify that, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should move on with what we think is fits, which is gender reaffirming surgery. So maybe just to move on to another point in the paper, right? There's this 2008 study that shows that some transgender women have a genetic variation that shows that their receptor gene for testosterone is less efficient at communicating signals. So this then leads to a more feminized brain. So essentially, their psychological makeup already concurred with the preferred biological makeup, right? And you did offer some problems with this idea. But before we talk about the problems, I was thinking to myself, okay, so say that's the case, right? So say you have men that for some variation in their testosterone levels, they have a more feminized brain, whatever that means, right? Why would we then jump straight to transgenderism instead of just saying that, oh, here's a guy who just happens to have a more feminized brain? Does it make sense? Why can't he just be a man with a more feminized brain instead of a woman, essentially?
Well, I mean, you certainly could say that, and there are a lot of people who live, without ever identifying as trans or seeking any kind of relief for that dysphoric condition. But the reason why we don't want to just across the board say, well, that's just a man with a feminized brain and leave it at that, is that, for a well-documented number of these people, that experience leads to intense psychological distress, motivating them to seek treatment or help with aligning their self-identity with this experience they're having, whether it's like a biopsychological or not. We know that the experience is sufficiently distressing that many people, feel immense relief upon transitioning, whether it's medically or socially or whatnot, right? So that's the reason, right? I mean, it's one thing to say that abstractly, and it's another thing to say to the people who are reporting on their experiences, that that's all that we're going to do for them, right? To help. Yeah. So I think you can't really have this conversation without like attending to the data and the testimony of people who report on their experiences, again, which are very different. I mean, there's a lot of different types of trans identity, but there is, a significant number of folks who suggest that that we need to take seriously as a society, like helping to help like give relief and to these individuals. And I guess you might say, well, it's not really relief, they're not really being helped. But I mean, I think it's inappropriate to make those claims in the face of evidence to the contrary, like from the people themselves who say, actually, when I transitioned, like that was the thing that helped me and saved me even. Right.
Okay, so I understand that aspect of, of the people that have transitioned, who have then experienced immense joy and relief after the fact, right? But would it be fair to take that as a principle that, oh, okay, the reason why they were feeling this way is because they were in a body that they were not in their preferred body. So once we transition them to their preferred body, boom, all of a sudden, all the problems are gone, right? I think my fear is that it seems to me, maybe there are some, besides testimonies, I think we need something more concrete besides testimonies that show us that it was indeed the fact that they're transitioned that made their lives better off, right? And the reason why I say this is because I'm thinking of it as a placebo effect, right? If I already think that by transitioning, I will be better off, therefore, once I do transition, I will then be better off. Does it make sense? So that's why I'm saying that I think we must have something more reliable besides testimonies. And I'm not saying that we should not believe what they're saying about themselves. No, what I'm saying is that we're dealing with a very sensitive topic, and to be fair, quite new, right? Especially with the technology that we have right now that allows people to transition at a faster rate. I believe so. So I think it is a very sensitive topic, and we ought to be careful with how we deal with it. So I do believe that yes, they feel this way, but I still feel that I still think that we do not have enough evidence that shows that the solution is transitioning. And I think to the same by the same token, there are cases of people that have experienced relief for a short period of time, and then that same anxiety, the same levels of depressions that they once had before transitioning, essentially came back, right? So wouldn't that then be, if we take transitioning as a principle, as the solution, the experiences of those people prove otherwise?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a couple things. One is that, I mean, I think you and I both agree that when it comes to diagnosis and treatment, we need to be super responsible and informed and um, and careful, right? When with proceeding. And I think that, the very best experts in these domains understand that. And of course, there have been failures. And yet, setting the failures aside, there have been a lot of successes. There have been a lot of successful, many successful instances, right, of appropriate diagnosis and treatment. And I guess, you can always wonder, well, was that really what that individual needed? But I think, without actually, I think in order to make those judgments, you would have to have a really deep understanding of the relevant psychiatric and psychological literature. Because these are people who understand that, yeah, of course you can make mistakes in diagnosis and treatment, but the job of a reputable and reliable treatment protocol ensures that those, or is trying to ensure that those diagnoses and treatment procedures are not running afoul of our very best medical knowledge, right? So, I mean, you could say what you're saying for any psychiatric diagnosis is a thing, right? It's always possible, right, that you get treated for, a condition, and then it turns out that it was actually a placebo effect, let's say. But we have data that suggests that, when you're given anti-anxiety medication or whatever, just to use one example, that there are that there are good reasons to believe that that they helped anxiety beyond just the placebo effect. And we do have ways of measuring to what degree a placebo effect is, likely taking place versus, I mean, we do that, right? We do that in our scientific trials. So I think all of that's to say that there's maybe we need to give more credence to and pay more attention to the science that has been done in this area.
So I am fully on board with what you just said. I do agree that it is possible to make mistakes in other areas of medicine besides transgenderism and the process of transitioning, right? But I think the caveat here is that when it comes to transitioning from one gender to another, that's a life-altering decision, in the sense that, yes, there are cases of people who have detransitioned, right? But we're talking about people who have pretty much changed their genitalia. And what happens to those individuals that, and we do have examples of people that pretty much just went through a whole gender reaffirming surgery, right? But then realized years down the line that they made a mistake, right? And they will have now they're going to have to live with that mistake for the rest of their lives, which I think it's different from somebody who takes wrong depression medicine, right? Because I think it's easier to fix that problem, right, than it is to fix. Assuming there is a problem, it's easier to fix that problem than it is to fix the former.
Yeah. I mean, so, two things. One is that I don't think we're disagreeing about the need to be responsible in diagnosis and treatment. But the thing is, that's a two-way street, right? So if you tell, a trans person that, hey, we're being responsible, and so we're not allowing you to transition because you could later come to regret it, that's not going to ring as the medically responsible thing to do for somebody who's sincerely, trans and who, really would benefit from transition, right? I think the problem is that nowadays we have so many more people, and especially young people, coming forward with gender identity, like with different gender identities, that you're seeing more mistakes being made, right? Which that just makes sense when the number is increasing exponentially. That's going to happen. And so, like, as medically and psychologically, we have to be really responsible. And I think there are all sorts of gender identity clinics and folks that are like taking very seriously this problem. I think they're starting to anyway, like they're starting to understand that there is a problem here that you're naming. Mm-hmm. But the fact that problem exists doesn't suggest that, sincerely identified trans individuals don't also exist and require the kind of care that they need, right? That there's ample evidence that even in cases in gender identity clinics where things have gone wrong, there are also things that have gone very right. And there are lots of patients there who say, yes, this treatment helped me. And I'm, and I mean, yeah, I think, of course, you can never be 100% certain about, any diagnosis in the realm of psychiatry, but again, that's what the work of psychiatry does. It's to try to get the best information that we can get to ensure the best diagnosis that helps people. And then when you see trends emerge over time, you can start to say, it does seem like this is the drug that helps people the most. And, of course, there could be other factors, but we work with what we have. The second thing is, I take your point, of course, that when we're making, changes to the body, like permanent changes, then the stakes are higher, and we have to ensure, especially, that we're being responsible. But again, there's just so many people who have reported that this is exactly what they needed. And I just think we have to attend to those stories and accounts when discussing this topic. Like, yeah.
Okay, I think maybe moving a little bit away from the psychiatry, right? I think there is an underlying philosophical question here of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. Because once we say that, let's take the factor of self-identification, right? Somebody that self-identifies as male, although they were born female, right? So now the question is, well, how do you know they were born female? Well, we just take a look at the biological makeup of that person, which maybe this is the part where we probably disagree, because in your paper, you talk about how there are no set of biological characteristics that are universal amongst, say, all women, right? So therefore, it is hard to say that based on the biology, this is what a woman is, right? To which I don't know if that's a fair assessment of what you said, right?
No, I know I say that in the paper.
Oh, okay. Yeah. To which I disagree, because I think that women have female genitalia they have XX chromosome. And even when you look at the bone composition, the pelvic, let's take the pelvic bone, for instance, right? You look at that and there's a difference between the male and the female pelvic bone composition. And I think the biological differences are important, and we shouldn't just disregard them, right? So taking into account the biological compositions, right? Shouldn't that then be the set characteristics that help us distinguish between what it means to be male and what it means to be female?
Mhm. So, I think it's important to note the conflation there too between like the sex terms and the gender terms, right? So
Okay.
this debate turns on, how we understand sex versus gender. And, if you understand if you understand the male and female sex kind of in terms of basic biology, like the type of gametes that one produces, right? So males produce small gametes and like called sperm, and females produce large gametes called eggs. And this is true for, not just the human species, and et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have that account of sex, then you will obviously deny that it's possible to change sex, right? Because at least as of now, we can't do that. But I also think that when it comes to determining, or when it comes to sex in society, we tend to care about a lot of things other than just gamete size, right? So you just gave an example too. Like you said, well, when it comes to, males and females, we're talking about things like genitals, right? We're talking about chromosomes. And I think it's important because medical technology has gotten us to a point now where a lot of what people care about with sex, you're right, is like genitals, is appearance. And if those things are in fact changed, then there is a sense in which, a trans woman has undergone a sex change, at least in one very socially relevant sense, right? Because if you have like a fully transitioned, medically transitioned trans woman who like passes entirely as a cis woman, right? I think for a lot of folks, like just saying that her sex is not female is going to be accurate in the sense of like gamete size, but also not entirely accurate when it comes to like her genitals, right? Her genitals are female genitals, right? So I think medical technology has like made these questions actually a lot more complicated because we've actually been able to like act on the body and make changes to people's like physical forms. And then I think that, if we distinguish between sex and gender, that's really where this debate gets complicated, right? Because if you want to understand a woman in terms of gender identity or in terms of gender social role, and there's all sorts of different accounts of gender out there, then that too is different from talking about sex, right? So saying that a trans person changes gender is going to be a different claim from saying that they change sex, right? Anyway, I feel like I got away from your original question there. Sorry.
No, not really, because now I think I'm trying. So I understand that there's been this ongoing debate around the difference between sex and gender. And I remember back in high school, a teacher told me, because I was one of those people who were saying there's no difference between sex and gender. And I remember a teacher telling me that, no, there is. Sex is based on your genitalia and gender is based on how you act in society. He was also making the argument that there's this fluidity when it comes to gender, right? Mm-hmm. So if there is this fluidity when it comes to gender, but there isn't much you can do as far as the sex, the biological composition is concerned, right? All the way down to, the gamete size and all that, then it can still be the case that you can be a man that just acts more feminine, but you're still a man, not a woman. If you take that to be true, then why is it then when somebody acts more feminine, then we ought to deal with that person as female instead of a man who just happens to act more feminine? Because I think that once we go from A to B, right, we are now disrupting the definitions that we were that we were brought up with, right? So one could say, oh yeah, that's what happens in society. As we progress, we change things to fit the status quo more, right? But still, we've lost concrete guidelines of what it means to be something. And once that happens, then it becomes arbitrary. But if it becomes arbitrary, then if you say that you are a woman, by the same token, if I don't agree with you, then I can't say that you're not a woman, because it is depending on how one views what it means to be male, female, man, or woman.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking deep questions here about how we should use gender terms, right? Should we use gender terms to track biological sex? I think your suggestion is yes, we should use gender terms to track biological sex. That's how we've always done it. We should keep doing it that way. And, there are arguments to be made on that side of things, right? But there are other answers that can be given to that question, right? So, I mean, there are a lot of variations now in people's gender expressions, right? So non-binary people, for instance, can make it difficult sometimes to, interpret whether or not they are sexed male or female. And in fact, they don't identify as men or women, they identify as non-binary. And they would, that's how they would like to exist in the world and feel most comfortable. So, to refer to them as man or woman based on, I guess, what one imagines their biological sex to be, you could still defend that idea, but I think that increasingly, because people's gender expressions kind of come apart from their sex, then we ought to ask, what are the reasons for continuing to refer to them, as based on their biological sex, which we might not even be able to know or discern easily based on their presentation, when in fact they are, asking to be treated as a member of a gender or a member of no gender, for instance, and not based on their sexed body, right? So, I mean, we just sort of would need to kind of get into the arguments, right, in favor of both views. But you're right. I mean, that's where the argument takes place. It takes place in terms of, how is it that we should be using gender terms nowadays in light of an increasing diversity of gender identity out there, right? Yeah. Right.
So here's one thing, right? I understand from a million point of view, right? And in your paper, and you said it as well in your paper, that is very million. You offer a very million perspective here, utilitarian in nature. And I understand what it means that, to live in a society and allow people to live their lives as they deem fit, so long as they don't harm anybody in society, right? So say somebody comes and says, I am non-binary, right? And that's how I identify myself. Okay, fair, right? That's how you want to live your life, then by all means necessary, live it as such, right? But then what's happening is that the person who identifies as non-binary would also want other members of society to approach them as non-binary, to relate with them as non-binary, in the sense that, well, A is non-binary, then A wants B to look at A as non-binary, right? Even if B may have different ideas of what it means, of gender and sex and all these different things.
I think, any kind of like compelled speech against one's individual beliefs, like, is a mistake, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think, first of all, you can't force people to believe something that they don't believe, but you also shouldn't be able to, force people to act in ways that are at odds with their beliefs, right? In a free, democratic, liberal society, right? I'm very wary of anything that polices speech. I think that we go down a very dangerous road. And in that sense, I'm also a million. Like I support John Stuart Mill's thoughts on free speech. And I think it's important to be able to speak in line with your own views. But I think, of course, you can also always find other ways of communicating with or about people that don't necessarily, use pronouns, or that there might be other ways of like respecting those individuals that doesn't require you to like misgender them to their face or something.
Mhm.
Right? And you might think that even if you believe that they're involved in like a fiction, it could still be that respectful treatment involves saying, well, even though I maybe think that, I don't necessarily need to like impose my view of onto that person. You could come to that conclusion, I think, and just avoid using pronouns at all, or right.
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, tolerance. So, if not acceptance, then tolerance. Essentially, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. No,
yeah,
I think I'm fully on board with that. So,
yeah,
I think you talked about how you're very much against any form of compelled speech, and that's also defended under a million um, a school of thought, right? I think that's a perfect segue to the last part of our conversation here, because the backlash you received was, I think unbeknownst to you, that was
mhm.
not expected at all. What surprised you the most? Were you surprised that people were coming against that they were against the article, or against the fact that you were the one who happened to write the article? Because I saw that part of the criticism was not so much based on the article per se, but more so on the fact that you, as a white woman, is the one that postulated this, this
Yeah,
idea.
yeah. I definitely expected that people might actually read this article and maybe respond to it, which typically when you're publishing as an academic, you sort of expect that like nobody
Yeah.
will really read what you write. So I thought people might actually read this and maybe even reply to it, because I knew obviously that um that wasn't the popular view at the time, and it was a topic of interest to many people. And there were some philosophers who had weighed in, like in the blogosphere, on the Dolezal controversy when it came out, and they mostly were, pretty much all of them were like pro-transgender but anti-transracial. Um, but I definitely didn't anticipate like the personal attacks and everything that ensued. I didn't anticipate like people trying to get the article retracted, and a petition signed by 800 academics. I mean, I never ever would have predicted any of that. Um, so yeah, that was all a shock to me for sure.
When I was aware of the backlash you received, I was more shocked to the fact that there were academics who were coming against you, right?
Mhm.
Because when I went to college in 2021, just 2 years ago, I was like, oh my God, this is the perfect place to just have all the different discussions around all the different things that I care about, right? Because everybody's just going to come at each other. Essentially, this is what the Octagon of Reason is. I thought about the concept. I was in Professor Sampson's class because I thought, oh, this is the Octagon of Reasons. We're just going at war with each other, but in a civilized manner. So that's what I thought college was going to be. But then here we have a professor that is being bombarded by her fellow colleagues, right? So if that's happening amongst professors, is there any hope for students? Is there any hope for student discourse? What do you think?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's definitely a scary moment in higher education. I think that the virtues we're trying to teach in the classroom of civil discourse and charitability and meaningful discussion across disagreement are often not embodied ideally among the faculty or among academics at large. I mean, of course, generally speaking, I think most academics look upon these kinds of cancellations and the nature of the discourse with like very lamentably, right? Like they're very upset about it, and they don't think that that's what academia should be like.
Mhm.
But yeah, in my experience, students are often like much more capable of having open-minded and civil like discussion about these topics. I mean, if you set the right kind of tone in the classroom and encourage open-mindedness and charitability, I think you can often see that students are capable of discussing these issues in sensitive and responsible manners. I mean, my experience having taught transracialism content in the classroom is that students are excellent at talking about it and disagreeing about it. Of course, I acknowledge that probably the students who are adamantly like against it and maybe me aren't going to come into my classroom. So
Yeah.
there's might be a self-selecting effect there.
Mhm.
Um, but um, but yeah, it's it's a really tough moment because I think a confluence of factors have led us to a moment where it's just very hard for people to come together across disagreement. I think social media has played a huge role in that um, with algorithms that force people into echo chambers that we know shield them from views that they disagree with, which increases their extreme confidence in their own views and makes them more these are like well documented phenomena at this point, but we can see the impacts that they're having in the academy, and like the simplistic sort of you know characterization of like the left or the right, and just precluding any real meaningful dialogue. So it's definitely a scary moment, and professors are unfortunately not immune from those larger influences. But I mean, I am encouraged by how many people are talking about those phenomena nowadays, and that there have been a number of organizations like Heterodox Academy and other places that are like explicitly trying to tackle these problems head on by like talking about the importance of viewpoint diversity for like a healthy um, inquiring community of knowers, right? There have been a lot of books and a lot of conversations in recent years about just this problem. So, and I think on our campus, people are talking about it. I hope students are talking about it. Our department certainly talks about it a lot.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing battle precisely because those spaces remain polarized, right? And it's tough to break across those barriers. Um,
Yeah, and I think you're right. And for me, the overarching fear is that it has completely changed how we, outside of academia, even how we just have our interpersonal relationships, right?
yeah.
I was joking with a friend of mine just before this episode. I was telling him, "Hey, I'm going to interview my professor. Her name is Professor Tovel. This is what she wrote," and he said, "Just make sure you delete my number before you post this," because he's like, "I don't want to be associated with you if this is what's going to happen, right?" Because we are because we are aware that not in not only they not only cancel you as the individual who maybe said something, but everybody who's associated with you also suffers, right? So it's insane how much this is
Yeah.
affecting the way we just relate with one another. Now I think we've gone way too far in this, to the point where we look at somebody's say for instance your racial identity already sort of foretells how you think. Does it make sense? So because I'm Black, therefore I must believe in this, right?
Yeah.
And maybe because I'm Black, then this conversation should have gone in a different way, right? It's like, oh, here she is, this the racist, trans, misogynistic professor or whatever, right? That was a hard word to pronounce, by the way. I had to practice so many times. But yeah. So, but there's that, right? And I think it's not helpful. And I personally felt that, going from Mozambique to the States, right? Because I felt that the States, I knew it beforehand, but you only realize how much you don't know once you find yourself in the terrain, because it is a very racialized society, right? There are times where I was talking to somebody and I would say something like, "Oh man, thank God you're Black saying that, because that kind of sounded white-ish," right? I was like, I don't know what that means. I'm just me. I'm just skeleton, right? But it seems to me that whatever I say, it's either, oh, this is what Black people say, but if I say the opposite, it's not me who's saying it. This is what a white person would say, right?
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that? Because I'm personally frustrated, because I was like, no, this is what I think. No, you're just being whitewashed, right? So how do we deal with that? What do you think?
Oh, that's so tricky. And yeah, I mean, I know especially like Black internationals, like who come to the States, who have reported on this experience like you're sharing here, who, like, it's a very different experience being Black in the US, for all sorts of reasons, but one of which is the set of expectations around your behavior and beliefs, right, that are kind of expected to have. And Anthony Appiah is a Black philosopher of race who talks about this quite a bit. Like he kind of laments the ways that minority identities can kind of get wrapped up with these strong expectations or scripts for how you ought to be. And he says that they can become imperial in that way, that it's like, you are not being a good Black representative, or you're not being a good gay man. He's both Black and gay, and just talks about, how dangerous identity scripts can be for that reason. And that we need to, I think, just constantly remind people of the radical internal diversity within groups, within racial groups, within gender groups, within any large group. But also, I think, remind people that, like, the very logic of discrimination functions to homogenize people across difference, right? Mm-hmm. So for someone to say to you, well, you clearly only hold that view because you've been whitewashed, is a way of saying that, because of your identity, you ought to only hold this set of beliefs, right? And that kind of erases your individuality and your ability as an individual to come to your own conclusions, right? Aside from the identity that you hold, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's just so crucial to kind of always remind people of that diversity. But this is a big problem, of course. And I think, I'm sure you, I commend you for asking me to do this interview. I'm sure that you have been or could be seen as like you betraying.
I'll be fine.
I don't know. I don't know what it's like.
I don't think so. I don't think that. No.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. So cool. But yeah, it's I think we've all just really, like, been struggling to exercise, like, the virtues of charity, honestly, with people, just jumping to the worst conclusions about why they, hold the views they hold or make the arguments that they make. I mean, a lot of the people, I think, also just don't really understand philosophy. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about philosophy. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is happening across the academy, of course, but I think with philosophy, it's just sort of seen as this, like, callous enterprise, according to which people just try to come up with arguments, regardless of whether or not they even think they're true, just in the service of trying to kind of engage in some sort of a battle, when really it's an enterprise of truth seeking. And again, the million assumption there is that in order to get at the truth, you just need to have all the best arguments on the table from multiple sides, right? Otherwise, as Mill says, he who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. You just can't know what you think if you just don't know all the arguments. So, that's really what philosophers are doing. And it is our duty, I think, to bring up the arguments that haven't been getting traction, right? The arguments that are considered verboten or that you're not supposed to talk about, because you need to evaluate them to get at the truth, right?
That was beautifully said. And I think I want to thank you for being one of those individuals that has brought forth this very controversial, argument, but still very much necessary in my opinion. And I want to commend you for your courage, because whether I agree or disagree with you, and I've told you how I feel about what I think about the things you have said. This is what needs to happen. We need to have more of this. And I thank you one more time for accepting my invitation. I hope this was not a one-off, because there's so many other things, many more things that I would love to converse with you. And I hope I have the opportunity to do that sometime down the line. So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Tovel.
Thank you, Kelton. No, thank you for inviting me. You're a lovely interviewer, and yeah, I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you. So this has been the Octagon of Reason, episode 4. If you have not done it by now, please subscribe to my channel. Make sure you like or maybe dislike this video, but just make sure you tell me on the comments down below. Follow me on my socials. On my Instagram is @GaltonGiovanni. By the time this video is out, my TikTok account will be active, which will be @GaltonGiovanni as well. So make sure you follow me there too. And you can find this podcast on Apple Podcast and on Spotify. Just search Octagon of Reason, and you should be able to find me there. So until next time, ciao, ciao.